Greetings, everyone. This is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today's video is going to be Torath Mosheh / Orthodox Judaism in the Age of the Universe. Now, for a baseline or foundation for this video, I suggest you watch the video I did recently, which is called Torath Mosheh in Science and Perspective, because it'll give you some of the background information needed to address and understand exactly what I'm going to be getting at in certain areas of this video, which I won't cover again from the previous video. So, if possible, I suggest you pause this video and go back to this video shown here for the baseline of what's going to be talked about in this video. So when it comes to this issue of, for example, one of the questions I recently saw in Quora that I put an answer in for, and I've seen it kind of pop up several times, is this question of exactly, how can the Torah, correlate between the time frame given in the book of, as people say in English, Genesis, with what science currently knows? And the only thing I would say to that is that, the Torah is not at odds with science because the Torah considers there to be a number of concepts that would have to be considered when addressing an issue like this. And one of them being what's called madai alohut. So that is essentially like considered to be like the almost like if you will the concepts of wisdom or even the science of something that is the power that created the universe or caused the universe to exist and the powers within the universe. Then, ha'ameth. Well, ha'ameth would be like the truth. What truthfully is the reality, based upon not only what, we find as humans to be our current understanding of reality, but also what, even without human understanding, is the reality. And then third thing is Matan Torah Sinai. And what this means is that, when the Torah was given to the Jewish people, it was given by the Creator or the source of, reality, the source of creation of all things. And the source of creation gave the Torah in a language, is in terms of the transmission, to which human beings can understand. But there's always things that are beyond humanity that would be beyond us. But the foundation of it is that the fact that the Jewish claim is not that, somebody sat in a cave or was in the desert by themselves or woke up one day and decided that they were something more than what they were, but more of the entire Israeli people, at Mount Sinai, and the creator of all things, made a national revelation, for in front of the entire nation. And this is the foundation of where these understandings come from that I, have expressed in the Torah, as well as the oral Torah that, kind of details some of it. So one principle that I always have to make clear to people that when I'm talking about this issue is something that can be found in a book called the Kuzari. And it's in the first book of that in section 7, where it says, "Chalila la'ela shetovo haTorah b'ma sheyidaha v'ra'oyom o mofet ach tovo b'niflaot v'shanot haminhagim levuriat davrim o להפוך דבר אל דבר אחר, להראות על חוכמת בורא העולם ויכולתו לעשות מה שחופץ בעת שיחפוץ." So essentially what this translates to is what I basically list here. The Torah was not given to contradict what is seen and proven to be reality or proven to be true. And what this means is that the Torah wasn't given to kind of be like a sleight of hand where it's like, okay, you think it's this and your research shows you this, and it's empirical where it comes back upon itself over and over again. But no, I'm going to fool you with something different, for example. That's not the point of the Torah. The basic issue here is that the reality as it exists, the way that it is proven to be true, is what it is. The Torah is not there to try to contradict that. Now, the question could sometimes be whether or not we have evidence towards what our beliefs are about what we think we've proven to be true. So for example, let's say that 1,000 years ago, the scientists of that day tested, the reality they lived in, came to a conclusion, and let's say for thousands of years that conclusion has returned upon itself no matter where in the world it's tested. No matter what generation is attempting to try to prove out the truth, but it keeps returning back to itself over and over again, then we can accept that to be true until the time where it's continuously proven to be false. And that's what the Torah is not here to contradict what we see and prove to be true. So when it comes to dealing with this issue of science, or even the topic of this video, what is the age of the universe? How old is it? There's a number of sources that can be used as a foundation for understanding the Torah-based mindset or the Torath Mosheh mindset. So all of these books you see here are books that describe them. And many of the authors are, from hundreds of years ago to thousands of years ago. So, for example, Rav Saad Gaon lived about 1,000 years ago. The Moreh Nevuchim by the Rambam lived, a couple hundred years ago, maybe about 500. The Ramban, same thing. Also, Ibn Ezra, but we also have rabbis, in the modern time that look at these issues from a Torah-based perspective in terms of science. And for example, these books here, Mahapach by Rav Zamir Cohen is a modern book where he goes through and and addresses scientific issues and uses the Torah and also goes through and says this is what the rabbis, the leaders of the Jewish communities for thousands of years have said about these topics. And it deals with topics like evolution, deals with topics like the age of the universe, things like that. And then there's also, Bokir Elohim Mesachek Kubiyot, that also deals with the topic of, the creator of all things in terms of the existence of reality, evolution, things like that. And then there's also a book here that, most of these books I have except for this one, because this one I haven't been able to get in print yet. But it deals with like, this the rabbi, not rabbi, sorry, Dr. Shlomo Kafach, who has dealt with biology, and he deals with like some of the issues in terms of evolution, the concepts of the theories behind it, what is known, what is not known, and what currently makes sense and what doesn't make sense based upon what we know. So we're going to focus in this video on two particular sources here. And those two sources, one of which I didn't list in the previous slide, is Rabbi Saadia Gaon, who lived from about 882 to 942 CE. His commentary on the book of Mishle. Now, Mishle in English, you know it as Proverbs, for example, for those who don't know Hebrew. So we're also going to deal with Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, the Rambam, in his particular book, called the Moreh Nevuchim. So the reasoning behind both of these books is Saadia Gaon, in his commentary on Mishle, has an introduction where he mentions a number of things concerning the issue of, like, for example, how we test out reality. In modern, he wrote it in Judeo-Arabic, which is essentially like it's an Arabic mixed with Hebrew, concepts here and there, as well as Hebrew understandings of, like a Jewish culture, but it's written in Hebrew script. So it's like using the Hebrew script, writing the Arabic language, but not in the Arabic script, but then also having ideas what if someone who understood Arabic would read it, they may understand elements of what he was writing, but the minute he gets to something that's strictly something only Jews would know, somebody wouldn't understand what he's talking about. The Moreh Nevuchim was also originally written in Judeo-Arabic by the Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, who lived from 1138 to 1204. And this particular translation, the one I'm using, was made by Rabbi Yosef Kapach, who lived in Yemen, and he translated it into modern Hebrew. And this is many people considered his currently to be like the golden standard of understanding this translation. He also translated this book here, which I'll be quoting both of them. So Rabbi Yosef Kaipach, who died, I think, in 2003, he actually translated both of these into modern Hebrew. This one contains both the modern Hebrew translation he made as well as the Judeo-Arabic. This particular copy only includes the modern Hebrew translation, but there's other versions of it that have like the Arabic also. They're the Judeo-Arabic. And that's those two. So let's start with Rav Saadia Gaon, because he lived about a little bit over 1,000 years ago. And, he lived in the Middle East. So, excuse me. If we consider his commentary on the book of Proverbs, in the introduction, he mentions something very interesting. He says, "Shlamut meda ba'arba ofanim." So he says that like the idea of the completion of like mada, which would be like wisdom, understanding, science, things like that, are like in four, kind of four matters, four issues, if you will. He says, "Achad hakubulath," and then another one, "V'harov haskira, v'harov hamakshavo, v'harov hahavchana." And he continues and says, "V'hashenei hachalokim hachoronim halalu mesharatin halakei hayidi'ah shehem halamidah havanat davar b'toch davar." So he says here that there are four, elements that are considered to be a part of the way of approaching, scientifically, if you will, trying to understand a matter into its completion, or having a complete understanding of, of a matter. And he lists them as being these four elements, which in the next slide I'll define exactly how he defines these four elements. But he's interestingly enough says about the last two that these are these two elements of like, of knowledge or, of understanding, or you could even say the science, is basically the idea of understanding a matter within a matter, meaning that what he's discussing when he says understanding a matter within a matter, it's like saying to understand the details of how something works, understand the mechanics of it, understanding the truth about how something works. So it'd be no different than, for example, me having a radio and simply playing it and saying, okay, well, it doesn't really matter how it works. It just works. But the opposite would be what he's talking about here is trying to understand the different elements of how it works and why it works the way it does so that I can understand a matter within a matter. So that would mean that, for example, I would have to open up the radio, see what's inside, understand what all the elements inside are actually doing, and understand, what principles allow those things to function the way they do. So this is my translation of what he's describing in these four elements. Well, hakbulat, he says, are basically translated to be like matters that have the basis of learning that is performed by listening to what one is being taught and working to understand what one is taught. Kind of like saying that when a student is learning from their teachers, professors, etc., how to read, write, perfect mathematical logic, etc., at a base level. So that's the first thing he mentioned as the first element that we start off with when trying to understand the science of a matter, if you will. And then haskira, or hasekara, he says the process, it translates, and this is me translating again, the process of said student taking in everything that they have learned, rehashing it, refreshing the learning, diving deeper into at a later time, etc. Like a person who takes what they learn during the courses in the day and they practice what they learn later that night to have a better grasp of it. And then the third concept is a hamakshava, the process of expanding on the first two concepts and challenging what one has previously learned in order to gain a more well-rounded understanding of the information and its proper context. This would be like someone taking the basics they learn in calculus and then adding to applying it to physics, or even learning other elements of foundations needed to gain a more complex view of the topic. So kind of expressing this a little bit differently. Again, like I said, be like learning calculus and then like learning how to apply it to the study of physics, for example. And then, anything that needs to be added to like help that understanding and help one work through that process, that would be, a matter of machshava, of this process, of challenging it. And then, not saying just because it's there doesn't mean it's true. Just because I get a certain answer doesn't mean it's true. And then the last one being ha'avchina, the process of testing a matter to determine if it matches with reality. This can include the process of forming a hypothesis and testing it. So as we see here, going back and taking into account that Rabbi Saad Dagon lived about 1,000 years ago, he's describing what in modern, Western terms would be basically the scientific process. Now, I got challenged by this by someone on a forum I was on who was trying to claim that, like, okay, like as if there was no such thing as the scientific method until the modern era. And then I started bringing up, well, like everybody agrees, every scientist agrees that every generation has its own type of science. The difference could easily be, for one, the technology, what's available to like actually do this process and actually test things. And then also, the ability to get like results that are not, let's say contaminated by things. So for example, let's say that 1,000 years ago, someone had, let's say the ability to test a process, but they weren't able to have a sterile environment. Well, obviously, the environment not being sterile is going to have an effect on their results, But we get into the modern era, we have more ability to make things sterile, so we can have better, results, even if the technology were supposedly the same. But think of it this way: in our modern time, we may look back at about, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, and say that they were lacking in the sciences. Well, obviously they weren't lacking in the sciences. They were lacking in some of the abilities that we have today. But think about what will happen in another 1,000 years. 1,000 years from now, they may say that we in our generation were superstitious. That we in our generation didn't understand science simply because they may have a better, better technology. May have better ways of getting the results that are more trustworthy and more accurate, where we may be lacking. I mean, one of the ways I look at it, it'd be like saying, okay, well, currently, as far as we know, nobody human has been to, inside of, let's say the atmosphere of Jupiter. Now, if someone were to actually go there, whatever they get, what they see and experience, there's going to be different than what we experience having just sent a probe inside of it that got destroyed pretty much. It's almost as soon as it got in there, to some degree. Obviously, they're going to look back and say, well, they didn't know what they were talking about, or they had a lack of understanding of certain things because they had no way to actually physically test the things that they were like, speculating about or postulating. There's certain things that we have no ability to test. One reason, for example, we can't test certain things is because of the fact that there are certain events that happen in time and we weren't there to see them. So therefore, if the event is gone, I obviously can't test certain things about it. And I can test some of the actor effects, but that doesn't always give me a good idea. So this is, the situation that Rav Sayad Dagon mentions about, being able to take something, learning the proper, like, methodologies of it, learning the basis of the foundations, and then being able to test it. So again, this person who brought this up to me as if I'm saying like nonsense by saying that, in past generations there were rabbis, or leaders of the Jewish community that had, the science of the day, as we often say it. They had that, and again, nobody's trying to claim that they had the same technology we had now, or the same capabilities, but they obviously had the same sciences, and it depends on what you want to call science. If someone wants to say, okay, they didn't have science, then I'll say they had madam, because that's a Hebrew word and that's as good as it gets. I look at it, for example, and personally say that a person who, let's say, figures out that a certain frog has skin that has like certain toxins on it that have a certain effect, well, that's science to me because he would have to figure it out and test it. Someone who says, okay, well, these berries here are okay to eat, but those over there are poisonous, that's a type of science too. So that's the way we would approach this. So getting into the Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, in his book Moreh Nevuchim, book 2, section 30, he says the following: Da ki yesh havdel ben harishon wa harishith. Now he's addressing something a little bit different than what Rabbi Sadia Gaon dealt with. He's dealing with this issue of exactly, okay, when we talk about the book of Genesis, in Hebrew it's called Beresheeth. So when we deal with the issue of Beresheeth, there's an interesting concept that he brings down where he's saying that there's a difference between the Hebrew word rishon or the word harishith. Harishon, harishith. That these have two different concepts that they bring along with them. So that's why I've marked them in red and blue. So every time you hear harishon, that's a certain concept. When you heard the word harishith, that's a different concept. And it's interesting to note again that the book of Genesis is called Beresheeth or Barashith, in Hebrew. So continue, he says, well, who shaharishith mitsui, who bama shehu lo rishith, o imo, wa af alapi shelo kadamon bazman. So he starts making this description of how the word Reshith, the same word that's used, for the book of Bereshith or the book of Genesis, is not containing the concept of time. That it's actually talking about something a bit different than the concept of time. So he continues and says, "Kamoshe omorim shahalev harishah hahai." When he gives like an example concerning like this issue of how the heart is like the first of a matter or something like that of life, but it's not talking about in terms of time. It's talking about like just a conceptual allegorical kind of understanding. And he says, "Waha yasod rishit hadavar shehu lo yasod." So what he basically says is that the foundational issue concerning the word reshith is that it's a matter concerning the foundation of something. So what this means is that when you deal with the word harishon, and he gets into this later, he's talking about this deals more with time, where reshith is not dealing with time, but more of the foundation of something. The thing that gives something, the foundation of structure, which everything else is built. And he says, "Wayesh shegam omrim basatom ala inyan ze shehu rishon, aval harishon yeshuhu ne'amar ala kodem bazman bilvad, bli sheyahem otho hakodem bazman siba lamit acher achorov." So this is where he talks about this issue of the word rishon dealing with the concept of time itself. Something that deals with time, something that deals with the fact that something within time happens and then something without times, or something precedes something in time itself. And then he goes on and says, "V'ha'olam lo nivra bereshit zemanit, kamo shebe'arnu ki zaman michalad hanivraim." So he says that the reality, or the reality of all things, was not created within the concept of time, like it's been explained. This is like jumping a little bit further in the text because he says that time itself is something that is created itself. So what's important to note, and I've mentioned this in other videos, that what he's basically describing is that when the creator of all things created everything, that part of that creation was the concept of time and the ability for there to be time. So, but that's only applicable to those things that are within time itself. And he continues and says, "Ofichach amar barashith wahabith," meaning this letter right here, habith, the inyan p betoch. So when he says that the letter here, Bereshit, the bet here, in front of the reshit part here, is there for the fact of conveying the idea of being within something. So it's like within reshit, or you could say maybe within the foundation. So when the Torah says Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz, Bereshit is basically talking about the idea of something, being the foundation of something, and that being within the foundation. So he's basically saying that, okay, when you deal with like the text of the Torah, Bereshit, it's not specifically dealing with the idea of time when in the written text itself. There's other elements of like, the oral Torah that deals with the concept of time, but not within the written text itself. It's dealing with concepts more than it is like, trying to deal with scientific, concepts of reality. So what this means is that when we look at the Torah, like we mentioned before, this is the first word in the written Torah in Hebrew. Bereshith, Boro Elohim, Ethel Shomayim, Wa Haaretz. So when we look at the text further, we can say, okay, well, if that's the case with just this first word, then we have to question everything here. And this is something that Jews who hold by the Torah and know Hebrew, we deal with this all the time when we deal with, when we look at the rabbis of previous generations and, what they've investigated or received from, previous generations about the Torah. So let's look at this word, hashomayim, which often is translated as in the heavens. But, again, that's problematic because of the English concept of what the word heavens means. And also this word here, ha'aretz, which is usually translated as the earth, but ha'aretz doesn't specifically mean the planet Earth. And especially in this context, there are, rabbis who say that hashomayim is from the root word sham, which basically means like there. And hashomayim being like with this letter here, yud, and mim at the end means something that is beyond, for example, humanity, beyond the concept of what we can see and experience, beyond reality as we understand it. And ha'aretz, one of the descriptions that that the rabbis have said for thousands of years on this is that this is dealing with what's called homer or matter, and not specifically like a particular planet, but just like the concept of like matter itself, and this is something that they discuss in different parts of Chazal. So if we look in, like they said before, if we take like a snapshot, and this is what Torath Mosheh Jews do all the time when we look through the different commentaries that exist about the Torah, we look and see that, for example, if we look at like Rabbis Ibn Ezra, who lived, I would say probably about maybe 600 or 700 years ago, I believe, and he talks about the issue of the word bara, for example, that means like to create, and that, essentially that idea is that when you have something that's created from nothing. So this is the idea, the word bara being shown in the Torah is dealing with creating something from nothing. So the idea here is that when the Torah says Beresheeth bara Elohim at hashomayim wa at haaretz, it's talking about Hashem creating shomayim, like we discussed earlier, wa at haaretz and haaretz from nothing. Both of them being created as something from nothing. And that's an important point because of the fact that it's dealing with the idea, if you will, of reality or matter within reality, and those things beyond what we perceive to be matter in reality, being created from nothing. So then, if we continue and look at the Ramban, for example, he basically talks about. He says, "Well, ato shema pirush hamikro al pishoto nachon uvorur hakadosh baruch hu bara kol hanivroim efesa mutchalat." So essentially what he's talking about is this is Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, who lived a little bit after the Rambam. And what he basically explains is the idea that Hashem created everything from basically nothing, efes afisa mukhlutat. Efes mafisa mukhlutat is like saying from complete nothing, for example. So he's saying that we don't have a concept beyond, in the language, the holy of the Lashon HaKodesh, meaning the Hebrew language, of bringing something from nothing, and that except for using the word bara. So the word bara is what's used in the Torah to express the idea of creating something from nothing. And he says, "Wa'ein kol ha'na'aseh tachat hashemesh ol ma'ala hawa min ma'ayin va'ein b'tachilat ha'rishona." אבל הוציא מן האפס הגמור מוחלט, יסוד דק מאוד, אין בה ממש, אבל הוא כוח ממשי, מכון לקבל הצורה. So he's basically talking about the idea that, he's going further into this idea of something being created from nothing. And that the idea that, Hashem, it's, basically the inventor of reality itself. And this is why you always hear me in some videos, you hear me say that the source of reality, rather than use the word God, for example, because I know the word God can be confusing when dealing with this issue, and especially dealing with the issue of when someone says, let's say a tree is a God, or, this person's a God, or this thing's a God. When the Torah deals with it, it's dealing with what is the source of reality, the source of creation itself, and the source of the ability for something to create or be created. And then going on, he says, ולצאת מן הכוח או הפועל, והוא החומר הראשון. So this is where he talks about what he calls the homer harishon, the first matter of reality, if you will. So this is something that, is discussed amongst, many of the rabbis from about the last 1,000 years or so, about the issue of like the first matter that Hashem created, which makes up the universe. And it says, Nikra le hayoli. So he says that in Greek, they often will call it I think it's like hayoli. And that's like basically like the first matter. V'acharei hayolin lo bara davar, aval yatzar va'asa. So he mentions something very interesting here. He says that after the first matter was created from nothing, that there was nothing that was made from nothing at that point, and that Hashem essentially took the matter that was created and made it into something, and it's denoted by the word yetzer or yatzar. So the word yatzar is used in the Torah, and these two words are used, within the, if you will, in English, the creation story, to discuss bara being creating something from nothing, yatzar meaning to take that something that was created and making it into some form, as he says, wa'asam. וכי ממנו המציא הכל והלביש הצורות ותקן אותם. So he basically says it's almost like if the creator of all things dressed up reality using that, that first matter that was created. And this is something that was being discussed, like this is like at least a couple hundred years ago, at least I would say about close to 500 years ago, that they were discussing this issue concerning the Torah and what it means. And they were getting this information from previous generations of Jews who had already discussed this. So then if we continue and go through, he says, So he says that basically in this view that he has, that everything that is, in the Shemaim, is essentially like of one matter, of one of one, if you will, type of matter or something like that. So he says that what's in Shemaim is one type of like thing or one type of matter, and then what's in like haaretz, we said earlier, often this is translated as the earth, but it's not like our planet Earth. It's just talking about like matter in general. So it's like he's saying that there's like a matter that's beyond the matter that we experience in reality, and there's matter that we experience in reality, and that these are two different types of matter. For example, V'hakadosh Baruch Hu bara elu shenehem me'ain. So these two things were created from nothing, if you will. V'shnehem lavadam nivraim v'hakol na'aseh mahem. So everything that exists in reality is from these two, matters. Either they're from Hashomayim, if you will, the first matter, or Haaretz, the first matter. And he goes on to kind of talk about this issue. And I'll keep going on. If you want to understand this particular or read more about what Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman wrote on this, I would suggest that you get his commentary on Beresheeth, preferably in Hebrew, because a lot of these concepts don't translate into English very well. But he talks about this in chapter 1 of his commentary on Beresheeth. So then if we look at another perspective on this, and there's another rabbi named Sforono, who in his commentary Beresheeth, Perek Aleph, meaning the first chapter of Genesis, is Pasuk Aleph, Beresheeth, Betchilat Hazman, V'hu Rega Rishon Bilati Mithalek, Shehu Haya Zman Kodem Lo. So he talks again about this issue of the concept of time being something that's created after it, and that when, the basic issue is that this is not really like Beresheeth is not talking about time, but that time itself was something that was a creation itself, especially when it deals with how we as humans experience time. So it says concerning the word bara, asa eno yeshno, uvaze lo yipol zaman kalal. So he says that something was, that the issue of creating something from nothing, and basically that time doesn't have any, if you will, standing within this concept or is in a part of that. So it's almost like saying, okay, if you were to go back and say, okay, well, how much time was it from the time that Hashem first started the creation until a certain point? And let's say when the Torah deals with Yom HaHod, you wouldn't really be able to like, factualize that and as we understand time, because we're matter, and matter, for example, is affected by time because of the fact that it's within a certain element of reality that is affected by time. But anything beyond that is not, time is just something that's created, but it's not a part of it. That he goes on and says concerning Et HaShomayim, we talked about that word earlier, something that's, he says, Hine Mila Shom, meaning that this part of the word shom, Torah al makom rochok. So he's talking about it's like considering the thing that's far away. V'chol siman harabim im kidamat patach mila'el yore al shenaim shovim. So he says like this, dealing with like the what do you call it, the vowel that's under the mem here. Deals with something that is dealing, and especially the yud and mem being here is dealing with something that is plural, for example. So it's like saying, okay, something that's like, if you will, in this case, very far away, but also something that's, concerning, two things that are kind of equal issues here. Well, it says, "V'chen milat shomayim Torah al etzem rochok beyachas aleinu b'shnei marahagim shovim mikol sad." So he basically talks about that this issue of Shemaim is something that's so far away from us, meaning humans in this reality, that it's like, talking about two different things, equal things on two different sides, on every side. He says, וזה לא יקרה, זו לפי בגלגל סובב, בתכלית העיגול. הוא אמר, אם כן, שברא אותו העצם, אשר הוא עתה רחוק ממנו, מכל צד בשני מרחקים, שווים בו הגלגל. So one of the things that's important to note is that during the time that these rabbis were writing, during the couple, it's about, I would say, 500 years to before, they often used the concepts that existed in the science of their time, which in some cases was the Greek philosophers, for example, because again, for their time that was what was considered science, and that can change for every generation. But they essentially are talking about things that are way beyond us, and they call these things kind of like the gal, which is almost like something that rotates. But you could also say that if you wanted to equate it to modern cosmology, which, some elements of the cosmology that they used during their time, has been kind of overturned to some level in the modern sense, but it's kind of like they were using the foundation that was available to them. But it's like saying that basically the elements of Shomayim is something that's so far outside or beyond humanity. And far and beyond humanity is not like a physical far and beyond humanity in all cases. In some cases, it's beyond humanity in terms of our able to grasp it or interact with it. So I think one way of looking at it is almost like the idea that currently is being discussed in scientific circles about dark matter. Well, I can't go into space and reach out and grab and pull out some dark matter. If it does exist, because again, it's theoretical on some level currently, I don't have the ability to manipulate it. I don't have the ability to control it. It's something that's beyond humanity. And it's all only at this point conceptual. I mean, it's no different than a black hole. We have seen things that, when you look in, parts of the universe that we would define as a black hole. And again, these are all human definitions of things, but I can't reach out and grab a black hole and like put it in a lab and, manipulate it and understand it, directly. And then he continues and says, ולכן לא אומר בראש שומן, כי לא יאמר כן מצד עצמו, אלא ביחס אל המקומנו, והוא אמר את הארץ. So he basically talks about, how it isn't just like the way that it's worded in the Torah. It isn't like that, that the term bara shomayim is basically, and this is sometimes one of these things that's kind of hard to try to translate into English fully, but he's basically dealing with the idea that there are certain elements that deal with like the reality as we see it, which is what's considered to be haaretz, for example, and then there are ideas that are beyond what we see, which has shomayim, for example. So, you can continue and go on where he talks about the issue of haaretz hatatahu wahu, about like what people translate as like the land, the earth was void. And again, knowing that it's not talking about the planet Earth, but haaretz meaning that matter itself. And he says, "Wa'otha haaretz hanivret oz, hatha davar murkov mehomer rishon, v'nikra thohu, hamisura rishona hanikret bohu." So this is where he starts getting into what I would say is what almost like is like a metaphysical discussion here concerning the issue of like the aretz, being thohu wa vohu, and essentially being like kind of an expanded kind of matter, if you will. And again, this is where to really understand this, you'd have to sit down, read it a number of times, and kind of like say, okay, what was the cosmology of their generation? What's the cosmology understanding at the moment? What do we know as fact? What do we know as being, something that we research but don't have the facts fully? So he gets into this idea concerning like the first matter and how it affects us, in our reality, for example. And I'll kind of leave that there because again, it gets into some deep issues that are kind of a little bit outside of the scope of what I'm going to discuss here. But I think it's important to know that this kind of information was being discussed hundreds of years ago to 1,000 years ago or more by rabbis of different generations. So getting back to the concept of the age of the universe, if we take everything we've learned so far, we can then add into the mix something that's considered to be in this text called Michtav Me'eliyahu, Kerech Bet Chelek Sheni, where he deals with this idea of time and what we've dealt with so far, that time is on our side in terms of it's something that we experience and quantify. But when you deal with like the creation of a universe, our concept of time is something that's way beyond, this concept of universal like existence is beyond our concept of time. Because think about it, where do we get our concepts of time from? Well, we get the concept of time because of the fact that as human beings, we'll only live a certain amount of time and then we'll be gone. And then we also look at the fact that, as time progresses towards that point where the matter that we're made up of breaks down, if you will, that's a really less than an eye blink within the concept of all of reality. So the basic Torah issue here would be, that whatever we find to be the physical slash beyond physical reality, then that's what we accept as being the reality. So currently the understanding is that it's about 13.7 or 14 billion years in terms of the universe. Now again, the concept of billions of years is something beyond humanity because none of us will live that long, and none of us can experience every element of what happens within that time frame. So if we use this as our example, this issue that if we said that in the Torah, the idea that Hashem created, something out of nothing, and consider this to be the beginning of, that Homer Harishon that, Chazal talked about. And then you have like, the universe, getting to the point that we exist in right now, if you will, in this particular model being here. There's no way to quantify all this stuff because we don't live long enough and we don't have the ability to go back and look at all of this and say exactly what got us from here to here at every single point in reality, meaning that on the on the microscopic level and the beyond microscopic level. So these are things that are considered to be in the Torah sense to be like kind of what people consider today Kabbalah. Something that you would have to kind of do like the Rabbi said, we mentioned earlier in the video, to research it, study it, and get rid of ideas that don't work and bring in ideas that do work and continue to like repeat the process over and over again. So then we further have concepts that we look in the book of Psalms, and it's called Tehillim in Hebrew, which would be chapter 104, verse 2. And it says, Adonai Elohe Jodolath Me'od, Hod Wahodor Levashath, Ata Or Kila Shlomo, Nota Shamayim Kiyira'ah. So essentially, what the idea that's being described here is the idea that Hashem is like spreading out reality, if you will. This is something that is also mentioned. The Ramban says, for example, in his commentary on Beresheeth or Genesis 1:1, he says, "Hashomayim hata me'ain nekuda b'chuthal megargir haradad u'nekuda acheret haaretz v'chol asher aleha." So what he mentions is that at some point all of reality was in some kind of like, if you will, compacted state, almost if you were to say like the size of like a grain of mustard seed. And then all of a sudden, it's like expanded outwards, for example, into like, what we have currently. So that's, these are the kind of concepts that they were being, discussing. So I've shown this in another video that deals with, some of the calculations that different, people have come to concerning how to use the information that various rabbis have given over the generations to come to our current cosmology, concerning the idea that maybe the universe is about 8 to 20 billion years old. And there are elements of all of the different, rabbis that have written things that you could take and come to the same conclusion that that's a correct number. So again, as we mentioned before, this is based upon, taking reality as we see it, taking the different, views of different, like rabbis and leaders who've investigated these issues, and then coming to the conclusion that's available. It could be that in another 20, 30 years or 1,000 years, someone may say, no, the universe is not 20 billion years old, it's 100 billion years old. And that's still perfectly fine by the Torath Mosheh sense because we don't have to have a specific number. And this element of time, 20 billion years or even 8 billion, is way beyond human comprehension. There's no way to comprehend 20 billion years because I've heard enough time trying to describe to people what happened within the 51 years I've been alive. Imagine me trying to discuss like 100 years or 1,000 years. I'll never get to every point of, something that's important in that discussion. And then this goes back to the Maharal, for example, in his book Tiferet Yisrael, where he discusses the same idea that time is like a concept of Kabbalah, if you will, or Mekubal. That it's a concept, dealing with something that's that is beyond the certain areas of our concept, and then certain things that are focused upon what we observe, and how we experience it within space time, for example. And then also, like I've shown before in other videos, there's this issue of, the way the Torah describes, the what people call the creation story, where it's not really like a creation story, we're more dealing with the foundations, where the first day, for example, is not described as first day in the written Torah. That essentially what it says is Yom Ha'od. Yom Ha'od means one day. But then all the other days are described Yom Sheni, Yom Shlishi, Yom Revi'i, Yom Hamishi, Yom Hashishi, Bayom Hashivi'i. Meaning, it'd be like someone saying one day, second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, sixth day, seventh day. And the question somebody could ask, well, why don't you just say first day, second day, third day, so on and so on? Why one day versus like first, second, or first day, things like that, or day one, things like that. And the reason is because, meaning according to like, some of the like the Rashi or the Malabim, that one of the ideas is that all kind of things happen within this Yom Echad. The first, mention of a day meaning one day, that all that this is basically not giving like a time frame of like days, 24 hours, things like that. This is before the concept of time, and that the concept of time only came about after Yom HaChot, or the one day that's mentioned in the Torah. And that's kind of a it's kind of a metaphysical concept, and it's kind of it'll blow your mind kind of thing. If a person grew up thinking that the text of Bereshith, as the people get it in English, is talking about 24-hour days or a time frame based on time, instead of like a foundation of how reality came about and what's important to us as humans as a foundation, then this is a completely different concept for people who haven't studied on the Hebrew Torah and known that these things existed thousands of years ago when Jews were discussing this. So then going back to we mentioned about, this frono, about the issue of time, that we mentioned before, that, time is something that was created, it's something that the creator put in place, but it's not something that we can say that, Bereshit goes, one day here, one day, second day there, third day here, fourth day here, fifth day, sixth day, seventh day, eighth day, ninth day, and here we go. It's more like saying these are the foundations of reality. And, as humans, we're required to like understand how the universe works. And it, like the Rambam mentions at some point in the Mishnah Torah, when we look in the sky and we see these things that are beyond us, we see the way reality has been placed. It causes us to love the Creator because it causes us to love what we've been, placed into, and how above and beyond us it is. So then, in summary, essentially, when dealing with the age of the universe, I would say it's just very simple. Whatever's proven to be the age of the universe is the age of the universe. Until, again, until it's proven to be otherwise. So that's as far as we would even need to go on it. And there's, a lot of the rest of it just be commentary. You know, I constantly am listening to what, like different scientific journals are saying, or, what different, scientists are finding, because this is interesting. These are things that help open and expand our understanding of the reality that Hashem has created in it and not contradict it. So this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever. Thank you for listening. Take care and bye.